I'm going to do a little intro up top here, which is what I do every time. This is an experiment that I'm doing because I am disabled, and one of the medications that I take for chronic nerve pain is called Lyrica. It's also known as pregabalin. It is the same type of drug as gabapentin, some of you may be familiar with, and it affects my central nervous system, which affects my ability to read to myself and understand what the fuck I just read. So instead of doing that, I am reading out loud on stream every week so that people who want me to read to them can have that experience, and people who want to have a book club and have live discussion can have that experience. And also, I get the experience of reading something and talking about it out loud so that I maybe can actually understand it a little bit better. Um, I am recording these. I will be posting them afterwards. They go up on here and they also go up on my YouTube channel, which I should probably put a link to somewhere. So I will put a link on Twitch for that. But if you will follow me anywhere else, you can find it in my link tree. I'm going to be streaming for at least an hour, maybe two. It kind of depends on how much steam I have. And we are reading High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. Last time I got to page 34, so we're going to be picking up from there. And hello, Phoenix. Thank you, thank you. I literally got my nails done yesterday. My nail tech is an actual genius, mad woman. She took all of the talent, and this is why nobody can ever find a good nail tech, is because she has all of the talent in the whole world. So thank you for noticing. I'm very happy with them. They are a little bulkier than I'm used to, but we persist. Okay, I'm gonna start reading out loud now. And where we got to last time was page 34. Here we go. Da da da. Talking about the divorced couple. Right. Okay. So we're talking about Gary and how he invented mediation, legal mediation, basically. Um, Starting with mediating for divorced couples, and then eventually that grew into the entire field of mediation. And we just talked about confirmation bias, and we just talked about how you can kind of interrupt an argument that is based around confirmation bias by asking more invasive isn't the right word, but asking questions and getting curious about okay, why did you just say that? Why did you word it that way? What is the significance of this specific thing that you said? Why that thing? Why not another thing? That kind of thing. Um, Asking those types of questions is generally very helpful in conflict resolution and mediation. All right, so page 35. Since his first seminars for the American Bar Association, Gary has trained thousands of lawyers, judges, and therapists around the world and taught negotiation courses at Stanford and Harvard. He's published 3 books. While other people have popularized many different styles of mediation, Gary's approach remains unusual. Oh, also, I am trying something a little bit different with the sound on this one. So if you notice that the sound is significantly worse than last time, please let me know. If you notice it's significantly better than last time, please let me know. All right, Gary's approach remains unusual. He insists on keeping everyone in the same room and together digging up what lies underneath the conflict. Other mediators separate the feuding parties into different rooms because it's easier. They stay on the surface, focused on fixing the immediate problem and not much more. That surface level work seems safer, and it is in the short term. Going deep into conflict is risky. It can ignite latent resentments, fueling ever more conflict, which I have for sure done before. Um, Whether it's trying to resolve a conflict that I am personally involved in, or trying to help somebody resolve a conflict they're involved in. I have definitely said the wrong thing or asked the wrong question and just made it so much worse. And like was like, actually I was almost not angry anymore. And then you said that, and now I'm angry again. And also I forgot that I was angry about this thing you reminded me about. So I'm triple angry. Like, good luck with your conflict resolution. But Gary doesn't, right? So to do this, Gary trains mediators to ask specific questions and to check to make sure that they understand each answer, a process he calls going down the why trail. If a couple is fighting over who gets the crock pot, he investigates why that crock pot matters so much. These questions help people lower their guard. Importantly, Gary trains his clients to do this for each other in the same room. So the people with the problem also own the problem, not him. In this way, he helps everyone in the room come to understand the situation and one another a little better, even as they continue to disagree. This understanding moves people from stuck to free. There is still conflict, but it's no longer a trap. There is nothing more important to a person who is undergoing a life crisis than to be understood, Gary likes to say. Being understood is more important than money or property. It's more important even than winning. Consider the crock pot. Gary might ask his wife, with genuine curiosity, what it means to her. Sorry, ask the wife, not Gary's wife. Gary and his wife are not getting a divorce. Gary might ask the wife, with genuine curiosity, what it means to her. It was from the couple's wedding registry, she explains eventually. It was a shinier version of the one that her own parents had used in her childhood home, where, as a little girl, she could smell a pot roast cooking all Sunday afternoon. She and her husband had not created that home in real life. They didn't even like to cook, let's be honest, but she wants the crock pot anyway. Her husband, hearing this, feels a sadness when he shares with his wife. He admits that he only wanted the crock pot because, well, she seemed to want it so much. This is hard to confess, but it comes as a relief. She is the one who wanted the whole divorce, he says, and since he can't stop the divorce, he supposes he's trying to make her at least feel some of the pain he's feeling. They start to see the understory of the crock pot, and that means they can loosen their grip on it and on other things. They get unstuck little by little. A man always has two reasons for what he does, a good one and the real one, as the banker Jean Pierpont, oh my God, John Pierpont Morgan, Jesus Christ, as the banker John Pierpont Morgan once said. I mean, I suppose that's true. Like, sometimes the real reason is just embarrassing. Like, why do I feel that way? Why do I have to admit that I feel that way? Can't I like make up a reason that actually makes sense that other people will understand, and then I can just say that reason and then nobody will question me and learn that I secretly am a terrible, awful, embarrassing person. Like, truly I have never had an original experience. All right. Every mediator has a story like this about some mundane object over which a couple clashes inexplicably. One California couple feuded so relentlessly over a broken hibachi grill that the judge finally offered to bring them the broken hibachi grill from his own garage if they would just stop fighting. In another case, a set of Legos practically brought one divorce proceeding to a standstill. The husband wanted the Legos, the wife wanted the Legos. They were paying their lawyers in 1 hour enough to buy all of those Legos many times over, which, like, current Lego prices being what they are, I don't know if that's still true. But, like, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, yeah, probably. It didn't matter because the Legos were not just Legos, they were their child's most precious toys. Where the Legos went, so went the child's affection, or so it seemed to them, quite naturally. Most of the time, people trapped in conflict don't know the understory. They get so focused on false flags like the crock pot or the Legos that they get stuck. High conflict is like a trance in this way. It's hard to look away. So Gary helps people step back and look at the Legos from a small distance with his questions and his listening so they understand what lies underneath. Because once people feel understood, they can relax their defenses. People can let many things go while holding fast to the things that matter most once they know what those things are. We are more willing and able to understand others when we feel understood ourselves, Gary and his co author, Jack Himmelstein, wrote in their book, Challenging Conflict. The traditional legal system, nope, the traditional adversarial legal system is designed to play into our worst conflict instincts, to go to war over Legos. Like cable TV news and many social media platforms, the law is designed mostly to perpetuate itself. Which, pause. Think about that for a minute. Like cable TV news and many social media platforms, the law is designed mostly to perpetuate itself. And as someone who has tied my ability to make money to pay for things and eat food to being good at doing social media, I gotta say, there seems to be this false idea that the purpose of social media is to connect us to each other, when in fact the purpose of social media is to make money for the people who own that social media platform and their various shareholders. And the way that they do that is by keeping people actively on that social media platform and engaging with it as much as possible for as long as possible. And something that is really, really good at getting people to continue engaging well beyond uh, the point in time that them continuing to engage is useful or healthy is high conflict. So there is a built in element to at least the big main social media platforms, which does make it really, really easy to get into high conflict situations and makes it very difficult to de escalate. I will continue reading. Stock market millions have been made by inciting high conflict systematically, creating a vast conflict industrial complex. By offering a way to go through conflict without making it worse, Gary and other pioneering mediators have done more to subvert this conflict industrial complex than most people alive today. Mediation typically costs a fraction of what a traditional divorce would cost in money and also in spirit. If he could make divorce less toxic, how much harder could politics be? That's right. I forgot. Gary had decided to go into local politics, the fool. Hello, Pringle. Don't worry about it. We record everything. You can catch up on what you missed by rewatching the little thingaling. And you only missed about a page. So you are good. All right. Trouble in Utopia. The tiny, fogged in village of Muir Beach, population 250, is only 20 minutes north of the Golden Gate Bridge, yet it feels like a secret. A velvet slip of sand nestled up against Muir Woods, surrounded entirely by national park land. Gary had lived here for the past 40 years. He and Trish had raised 4 children in the community. Muir Beach is a home to an unusual mix of people. There are the aging bohemians and beatniks who came here in the 1960s and still talk about the time the Grateful Dead played on the beach. These folks migrated over from Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco way before there was such a thing as Silicon Valley, 45 minutes south of Muir Beach. After Janis Joplin died of a heroin overdose in 1970, her ashes were scattered here, or so the rumor goes. Then there are the libertarians who moved here because it feels impossibly far from everything. There are no streetlights or grocery stores, just over 100 homes, perched above acres of swaying beach grasses and a small nude beach. Yeah, definitely every libertarian I've ever met would be like, oh, a nude beach? Say no more. Um, a very accurate read from this author. In the early 1970s, a nostalgic British expat wanted to build a Tudor-style English tavern. It took him 8 years to overcome the local opposition. The result, the Pelican Inn, remains the only commercial enterprise in town. In 1984, the New York Times described Muir Beach as a place of, quote, unstrained, unlittered Pacific isolation, unquote. And that still feels right. The most recent arrivals are the opposite of the beatniks in many ways. They leave early in the morning to go to work in the city, and they come home late. You don't see them as much, but they tend to own the most expensive houses, the ones with the scorchingly modern architecture, high up on the cliffs. It's hard to get beatniks, libertarians, and tech capitalists to agree on priorities, which was one of the reasons that local politics had become fraught in Muir Beach. Some neighbors wanted to invest in new roads and bridges, and others wanted to be left alone. Some were consumed with worries about climate change and wildfires, while others resented how much they paid in taxes. This discord made for some long, tortured public meetings. Trish and Gary had arrived in 1976 after flirting with the New Age subculture but never really committing to it. They bought one of the last available parcels of land, which is to say that they got very lucky, and managed to build a modest home in an achingly beautiful place that only multimillionaires can afford today. And they know just how lucky they are. They have both come to love the place in different ways. For Gary, living in Muir Beach made his work on conflict possible. He'd spend hours in his office in nearby Mill Valley, submerged in his clients' rage and blame. At the end of the day, he had to pull himself out somehow. So Gary would bike home. His commute took him exactly 42 minutes, beginning on steep hills, then rolling through the wet, dense shade of redwoods, before emerging into the light of the beach and a long view of sparkling ocean or rolling fog, depending on the day's weather. When he got home, he was ready to tend to his garden, which always took his mind to a better place. Later, he might put some meat on the grill while Trish made a salad. Before bed, they'd slip into the jacuzzi out back, listening to the waves, talking about their days. Trish was a psychotherapist, and he learned from her stories and she from his. In the morning, he'd meditate in a small lean-to he'd built next to his garden, overlooking the Pacific, readying himself for the turmoil that awaited him at work. I mean, goddamn, it's a great gig if you can get it. Like, yes, they were very lucky. They know they're lucky. They are lucky. Am I extremely jealous? Yes, 100%. Unfortunately, I was born far too late to ever take advantage of that particular uh, oasis. So it's not personal. That said, I remember the first time I read this book, reading that section and going like, okay, so if you are involved in a lot of high conflict stuff, then it is super fucking important to have something that is untouchable, like something that is this is the safe place you go to, this is the safe thing that you do, like whether it's exercise or reading or meditating or gardening or making candy or crocheting or whatever, like you have to have a thing that you keep separate from everything else, or else everything just becomes high conflict and then you die. And I forgot that that was actually a thing that I need. And so when I relax, I feel guilty, but I need to cut that shit out. It's actually important to have some actual relax time. All right. It was not lost on Gary that he lived in a utopia. He actually felt a little guilty about it. He worried a lot about economic inequality in the country, and yet here he was, living in a place that was out of reach for most Americans. Maybe if he ran for office, he could change that too, opening up some space for affordable housing. It was all starting to make sense, this politics idea. Gary didn't socialize much in the neighborhood. That was Trish's role. She was the one who brought muffins to sick neighbors, who knew all the children's names. For Trish, Muir Beach was less a refuge than a community. It was a place of deep connections and long friendships. Actually, she was the one Cassidy had said on their hike who should run for office. That made a lot of sense, Gary thought. Trish would be a wonderful public servant, but she didn't want to run, and he did. Not long afterward, Gary drove his forest green Mini Cooper to the county elections office and filed the paperwork to become a candidate. The New Guard. Muir Beach is magic, Gary said, speaking before his neighbors at the candidates debate in September 2015. That was the first thought that my wife Trish and I had when we first saw it, and that's why we moved here. Gary and the other candidates were seated in a row behind a long table. The windows behind them overlooked the town playground, and beyond it, the vast ocean. The vast ocean with a V, not an F. The community center was packed, with an overflow crowd standing in the back. Cassidy had stayed home, but Gary's daughter, Sydney, was there, sitting next to Trish, who held Artie on a leash. Artie is their dog, not their other child. It was exhilarating to see so many people assembled. Gary had attended some town meetings in recent weeks in preparation for his campaign, and usually he just saw a handful of other people, often the same people, many of whom liked to hear themselves talk. But this night was different. Gary was campaigning as an insurgent, running alongside Elizabeth, another political novice, against a group of incumbents who had been in charge for decades. At Gary's request, I've changed the names of the neighbors involved in this story to protect their privacy. The names of Gary and his family are unchanged. Jim, for example, had been on the board for the previous 29 years. He was the board, in a way. Another neighbor named Hugh had spent 4 years on the board before becoming the district manager, a hired position charged with carrying out the board's decisions. For the past 12 years, Jim and Hugh had gotten used to working closely together in these roles without much public interference. In private, Gary started referring to these incumbents and their backers as the old guard. He and Elizabeth and their supporters were the new guard, in opposition to them. That night, Gary seemed like the kind of politician we want but never get. His face lit up when he talked about the beach and his grandkids. He was warm and quick to laugh at himself. When people asked questions, he listened in ways that made them feel heard. He told them he wanted to reinvigorate democracy in the town. This is a chance for real change, he said, for everyone to be involved. Gary's model of mediation was built on this idea that everyone needed to be in the room. In 1996, the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra went on strike, walking out for 67 days and canceling 43 concerts. Gary worked with their fellow nope. Gary worked with fellow lawyer Robert Mnookin. Really? I can't be saying that right. It's Mnookin. Apologies, Robert. Fellow lawyer Robert Mnookin and others to mediate the case, and they insisted on involving all 105 musicians, not just a handful of representatives. Normally, lawyers would deal with lawyers shuttling back and forth, trading this for that, but they wanted everybody to understand the crockpot and everything it represented. Otherwise, the underlying conflicts would just resurface the next year. The musicians had presented management with a list of 65 demands, including better pay and benefits. The musicians claimed that they were overworked and underappreciated. In response, management had insisted that the organization was running a deficit and could not afford such extravagances. Neither side believed the other. In December of 1996, the musicians canceled a sold out Mozart concert and took to the picket lines. Dressed in their elegant performance outfits, they played taps on their instruments. Honestly, iconic. Fucking icons. And also, I feel like we should start doing this. We bring this back. Let's orchestra, taps, every protest. All right. It feels like we have to do this every 3 years. It's very discouraging, Mariko Smiley, a violinist, told the San Francisco Examiner. I'm sure there's a better way, said one of the dismayed ticket holders watching the surreal scene. To push the musicians into negotiating, management withheld health insurance benefits. In protest, a bassoonist held up his sick toddler before TV news cameras. Concertgoers started demanding refunds and withholding donations. Everyone was losing every day. A kind of desperation set in on both sides, where each of us said to ourselves, "We're not going to get anywhere with these people. They don't even hear what we're saying," said Peter Pastrich, the executive director and chief negotiator on behalf of the symphony management. And that turned into a great anger. By the time Gary and Mnookin, a Harvard Law School professor, arrived on the scene, the walkout had ended, but the symphony was still trapped in conflict. The musicians had fractured into competing camps. Some felt they'd caved too soon. The string section felt particularly aggrieved. Violinists and cellists tended to play more than the others, and they were complaining of repetitive stress injuries. Another walkout seemed inevitable. In this fog of hostility, Gary and his colleagues set up a series of workshops to train the musicians to extract themselves from the tar pits. First, they taught them a form of active listening Gary calls completing the loop of understanding, or looping. It's one of his most powerful tools as a mediator. Basically, it means to listen in ways people can see. Show them you're listening, don't tell them you are. Most of us do not feel heard much of the time. That's because most people don't know how to listen. We jump to conclusions. We think we understand when we don't. We tee up our next point before the other person is finished talking. I am also highly guilty of this. It is bad. I have to actually make myself stop and think and go, hey, this conversation is important and you need to give a fuck about what the other person is saying and not assume that you know what they're going to say. Because, at least 50% of the time, I don't. I'm just straight up wrong. But it takes so much practice. It is not something that comes naturally to me. On average, doctors interrupt patients after only 11 seconds of listening to them. That's a typo. All right. On average, doctors interrupt patients after only 11 seconds of listening to explain what ails them. Nope, that's not a typo. That's just my brain reading it weird. So sorry. All right, here we go. On average, doctors interrupt patients after only 11 seconds of listening to them to explain what ails them. When doctors don't interrupt, patients stop talking on their own just 6 seconds later. That's all the time they need to explain themselves, just 17 seconds. But almost none of them get it, as any of us who has gone to see a doctor recently may have experienced. And there are real consequences to our bad listening, the kind you can measure. When people don't feel heard, they get slightly anxious and defensive. They say less, and whatever they do say tends to be oversimplified. The walls go up. But when people do feel heard, magical things happen. They make more coherent and intriguing points. They acknowledge their own inconsistencies willingly. They become more flexible. Customers who feel heard by their financial advisors are more likely to trust them and to pay for their services. Workers who feel heard perform better and like their bosses more. Patients, if they feel understood, leave the hospital more satisfied and more likely to follow their doctor's orders. I have some opinions about doctors and listening to chronically ill patients. As a person who is chronically ill and also presents as a woman, I have been to many, many doctor's appointments in the past couple of years, and yep, lots of doctors not interested in listening. Also, I appreciate what she's saying here about oh yeah, if patients feel like they were understood, they'll leave more satisfied. They'll be more likely to follow doctor's orders. Also, if the doctor listens to the patient, they can correctly diagnose what is going on and um not send somebody away who then dies because they didn't get care they should have gotten. Anyway, okay. I will move on. Among couples, people who feel more understood by their partners can make use of conflict without doing damage. Arguing actually seems to make them feel better, not worse, even as they continue to disagree. The conflict is healthy. Hagai and I do recreationally argue about things sometimes. That is true. Gary knew there was no way to get out of a conflict trap without better listening skills. So, he divided the musicians into pairs and had them practice looping. One person listened while the other explained why she'd joined the orchestra to begin with. When the talker said something that seemed important to her, the listener played it back to her to see if he'd understood. The listener didn't repeat what she'd said word for word like a robot. He tried instead to distill what he thought she'd meant into the most elegant language he could muster. Then he asked if he'd gotten it right. And like this is a thing that I do actually do. This looping I have incorporated as a habit because I have practiced it so much. Um, and the way that I like to do it, like my preference of script, I guess, for lack of a better word, sort of like how to do it, is I will straight up say like, "Hey, I want to make sure that I actually am understanding what you're telling me. I'm gonna repeat it back to you, um, and like explain it to make sure that I am not missing anything important, right?" And so that contextualizes it very, very like simply, very easily, very immediately, and also makes it clear that it's not like I'm not um trying to be annoying. I'm not repeating what you say back at you in like a mocking manner. I'm also not deliberately trying to put words into your mouth that you didn't say. And in fact, I am trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to make sure that like we are on the same page and I do understand like I get that you're upset. I want to make sure that I understand why you're upset, what you're upset about. And so I'm going to like every so often I'm going to repeat it back to you. And then just like do that. And it works really, really well because then the other person doesn't get defensive about like, well, that's not what I said. Like, yeah, no, I know. Hey, that's the point. That's why we're doing this. I'm glad that's not what you said because I was confused about it. So like what can let's figure out where the missing link is. And it makes things a lot easier. All right. So he's doing this looping drill with the orchestra. So it sounds like you joined the symphony originally because you wanted to challenge yourself to play alongside some of the greatest musicians of the world. Is that right? One of two things happened when the musicians did this. First, the listeners did not get it right as often as they expected. That's partly because we all make assumptions when we hear people talk, some of which are off base. And it's partly because it's hard for any human to convey exactly what she means the first time she's asked. For example, the violinist might refine her point when it gets played back to her. Actually, I was looking for inspiration, not just challenge. I wanted to feel that sense of wonder, I guess you'd call it, that I'd felt for music when I was younger. To grasp what someone really means, the musicians learned, requires both curiosity and double checking. Second, the listeners learned that people really, really appreciate being heard. When they'd looped the talker correctly, the talker almost always responded the same way. Their eyes lit up and they said exactly. For Gary, it was a lovely thing to see. When people feel understood, they trust the other person to go a little deeper and keep trying to get it right. This iterative back and forth process helped the musicians identify what was really important to them as a group. The goal was to find what lay beneath their various contract demands. Why was the crock pot or the vacation allowance important to them? This was a fascinating exercise for me, one violinist said. I've been playing alongside Phil for the last 15 years, and we've talked about a number of things, but until now, we never talked about why we love doing what we do. In this way, the musicians were able to identify their most important shared concerns and come up with a shorter list of priorities. They wanted better pay not just for the cash money, but also because they worried about fairness in the future. They wanted to feel that their compensation was commensurate with other symphonies so they could attract new talent. Management wanted those things too, as it turned out, but there had been no opportunity to come to that realization because neither side was really listening to each other. I came to understand how important it was for me to listen, said Pastrich, whatever, the chief negotiator on the management side. It became clear to me that one of the things that the musicians were angry with me about was that they felt that I wasn't even listening to what they were saying. And I think it is true, he said, nor do I think they were listening to us. Once we feel understood, we see options we couldn't see before. We feel some ownership over the search for solutions. Then, even if we don't get our way, we are more accepting of the result because we helped build it. It took many weeks, but the new contract provided a pay increase that made the San Francisco Symphony one of the best paid symphonies in America. It also took some of the strain off the string section. and it didn't imperil the financial health of the organization. The musicians overwhelmingly ratified the new contract, which was set to 6 years, twice the usual length. After a joint press conference announcing the agreement, the bassoonist kissed the board director on the cheek. It was like watching Jay and Lorna all over again, which is very cute. Very cute, and I love it. Winning. The night of the candidates' debate, Gary imagined that every town meeting could be just as crowded. The elected officials wouldn't own the problems or the solutions, the people would, just like the musicians in San Francisco. Boy, has Muir Beach changed, Gary told the crowd. He knew from decades of public speaking how to connect with an audience. He smiled, making eye contact with his neighbors, taking his time. We have many more pressures on us, on the land and the watershed, than we had any idea would come back in those days. He had their full attention, and it felt good. He may have been one of the oldest people running, but he really did feel like an up and comer. He was doing what he'd imagined he could do, bringing people together without putting anyone else down. Politics did not have to be ruthless. I'm up for the challenge, he said, to make the magic go on. In the weeks before, Gary, Elizabeth, and Trish had gone door to door talking to neighbors Gary had never met before, urging them to vote for change. A neighbor named Tanya had volunteered to be Gary's political advisor. Born into a family of politicians, she had spent her entire career as a labor organizer, writing articles and books about how to fight the powerful and help America's workers. So it came naturally to Tanya to draft talking points and create a strategic plan for Gary's campaign. She upped Gary's game, making it more like a traditional political campaign than the typical Muir Beach candidacy. We knocked on all doors 3 times, she told me. That has never been done before. With Tanya's advice, Gary adopted the campaign slogan, "Do you want to move forward or backwards?" Tanya talked a lot about winning. Soon Gary did too. And that, readers, we call foreshadowing. At the candidates forum, when someone asked him about his experience with managing water, the most important job of a community board in a remote, often drought-stricken place like Muir Beach, Gary responded with honesty. "I don't know that much about water, but I know I can learn," he said. This was not what politicians were supposed to say. That's why he said it. Gary took pleasure in breaking the political mold, in proving that there was a way to do politics honestly and inclusively. After the debate, Gary's wife and daughter embraced him, their pride visible. People came up to shake his hand. The only criticism came from Tanya, who told him he should not have answered the water question so honestly. It was a mistake, she said, it was a mistake, she said, to reveal any weakness to his rivals. In the following days, neighbors brought bottles of wine to the house, thanking him for what he was doing. In the Marin Independent Journal, Gary promised a new order if elected. "I am committed to bringing a tone of respect, enthusiasm, and openness to meetings and to interactions with others." On Election Day, November 3rd, 2015, the county posted the results online at 11 p.m. Gary received far more votes than any other candidate. Elizabeth won too. Together, they defeated 2 members of the old guard, including Jim, who had been in office for nearly 3 decades. He had lost by just 4 votes. "We killed him," Tanya said later. Gary felt euphoric. He had started his campaign because he believed it was possible to revive democracy even now, that people will get involved if you listen to them, if you empowered them. It was the central contribution of his life's work, and now he was applying it to politics. And it was working, undeniably. Muir Beach reported the highest turnout for any race in Marin County that election cycle. A whopping 74% of residents had come out to vote. All was not lost, here or anywhere. A neighbor and fellow board member named Joel told Gary he wanted to be board president, a position voted on by the rest of the board at their first meeting. But Gary gently convinced him not to do so. Gary wanted to be president himself. He thought it would be the best thing for the community. Joel agreed to step aside. "We're going to come together," he told Trish. "We're going to live up to the promise." That is the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Power of the Binary. In 1775, American revolutionaries John Adams and Thomas Jefferson met as delegates to the Continental Congress, the body governing America's 13 colonies. They could not have been more different, really. Adams was short and sarcastic. He talked a lot and lost his temper easily. Jefferson was tall and elegant. He remained silent in the public sessions, saving his voice for the smaller committees. He was amiable and diplomatic, reluctant to offend. And yet, as anyone who has seen Hamilton knows, the two men became fast friends. Adams came to see the younger Jefferson as a sort of protege. The next year, he persuaded Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence, which both men signed. Their friendship deepened in the 1780s when they were posted to Europe on diplomatic missions. Both men loathed the ideal of political parties. Adams called them the greatest political evil imaginable. Jefferson thought party loyalty represented the last degradation of a free and moral agent. They understood the danger of collapsing civilization into two sides. Neither of them imagined that the country would be split apart by their own supporters. But that was back when they were speaking to one another. As time went on, Jefferson and Adams began to hold different views about the future of the new nation. Jefferson was suspicious of central government, while Adams felt a strong government was necessary to get things done. Both opinions had merit, and they remained friends, able to disagree with warmth. Then, in 1796, the Democratic Republican Party backed Jefferson for president, while the Federalists got behind Adams. It was the first contested presidential election in American history. Holy shit. There were two parties, dividing Americans, just as Jefferson and Adams had feared. The campaign got ugly, and the followers of both men used their writings against them. Adams won in the end, but Jefferson had come uncomfortably close to beating him, falling just 3 electoral votes short of a victory. To Adams, this affront, from his protege no less, felt like a humiliation, and it lingered in his heart and his head. By its very nature, politics sorts us into binary categories: Democrats versus Republicans, incumbents versus upstarts, old guard versus new. Sorting almost guarantees conflict, as Jefferson and Adams had warned it would. There are, all of a sudden, two sides, and everyone must choose. It's not for nothing the word category comes from the Greek word for accusation. After the election, Jefferson drafted a letter to Adams to smooth things over. He emphasized his continued friendship, loyalty, and respect. It was a good idea. He must have sensed that the campaign had left Adams feeling battered, and he wanted to repair their bond. But James Madison, the party leader who had convinced Jefferson to run, advised Jefferson against sending the letter. Adams might not respond well, he warned, and what if the letter got leaked somehow? Jefferson's supporters might feel betrayed by the conciliatory tone. So Jefferson never sent the letter, which is a pity. Men named James are it's close. The two men governed together, as expected in those days, with short, sarcastic Adams as president and the tall and elegant Jefferson as vice president. But they spoke less often. When they took different views on various issues, this distance made it easier for each man to assume the worst of the other. In 1800, Jefferson ran for president again. The campaign was even nastier this time. Back then, individual candidates did not personally campaign. That was left to their followers. But it felt quite personal all the same, as both sides spread rumors and demeaned their opponents. Jefferson hired a journalist of dubious character to badmouth Adams in the press. It was fake news, 19th century style. Oh boy. Meanwhile, President Adams had assumed that he would be able to continue to hold office until he chose to leave, as George Washington had before him. There was no precedent for a new president being ousted in this way, but caricatured by Jefferson's party as an out-of-touch monarchist, Adams lost his re-election bid. It was a painful defeat for Adams. But there was a bigger picture to keep in mind. His old friend and protege was taking his place, presiding over a new and unstable nation. For the sake of the country, there was much they should discuss, lessons they should share, alliances they could create. But that's not what happened. On Jefferson's inauguration day, Adams left Washington in a stagecoach at 4 in the morning. He became the first American president not to welcome his successor. So you see, the petty does in fact run deep and long in our presidential traditions. History books focus on ideological differences between Adams and Jefferson, but ideology was just the crockpot. The understory of this conflict was betrayal, ostracism, and humiliation, about who belonged and who did not. With their own feud, Jefferson and Adams proved that they'd been right about the danger of parties. Any system that pits groups of people against each other can lead to high conflict. It doesn't have to, not if people talk about the conflict honestly, out in the open, and find ways to resist the power of binary thinking. What would have happened if Jefferson had mailed that letter to Adams, reminding them both that they were friends and fellow Americans before they were partisans? As it was, Adams remained embittered, telling his son a year after the election that Jefferson was impulsive and unreliable. His ambition and his cunning are the only steady qualities in him. He and Jefferson did not speak to one another for 11 years, until finally someone else rescued them from the tar pits, sort of like Gary or another mediator might today. Excuse me. As we'll see, there was a way to transcend the false binaries of partisanship even then. Categories and accusations. Quote, overcategorization is perhaps the commonest trick of the human mind, unquote. Gordon Allport, The Nature of Prejudice. Back in Muir Beach during the run-up to the election, Gary stopped talking about me and you and started talking about forward and backward, us and them. He put himself in one category and other people in a separate category, a lesser category. In regular life, we put people in categories all the time. That's how we navigate the world, as social animals who evolved in small groups. About 52 million years ago, scientists estimate, our ancestors stopped traveling through life alone. Groups, they discovered, offered a fantastic way to stay alive. This was especially true when primates started hunting during the day, which made them vulnerable to predators. In sunshine, groups mattered more than ever. Categories save us time and energy by allowing us to treat individuals the same way, so we don't have to look too closely or think too much. And categories also make us feel good about ourselves. The white woman who puts a Black Lives Matter sign on her front lawn feels like she is in the tribe of the woke. The French driver who puts a yellow vest on the dashboard of his car feels like he is in the tribe of the aggrieved workers fighting the establishment. But categories blur out important details. They're efficient, yet slippery. Once we have a them to contrast with an us, we change. We know this from decades of research all over the world. Under the influence of categories, we are less likely to cooperate with the other group and more likely to become hostile. We subtly adjust how we think and act in order to better fit our category. This tendency is automatic, and it happens even when people are divided in an arbitrary way. On the set of the 1968 film Planet of the Apes, the actors playing chimps and the ones playing gorillas ate lunch in separate groups. They just felt more comfortable with people in their same costume category. It takes shockingly little for groups to become tribes, for favoritism to emerge. It doesn't require competition, ritual, pep rallies, or financial incentives. It only requires a belief that you are in one group and others are in another. And say we've all experienced this. I think we all here now can think of some examples of this. But I will just say you see this in very silly ways in the rave scene. Famously, people who listen to dubstep music, headbanger stuff, Skrillex, Excision, Subtronics, that kind of genre of music, and people who primarily listen to house music, um, John Summit, Daft Punk, kind of what you think of if you are a millennial and someone says techno, you're probably thinking of house if you're not a raver. Um, it's when I was in middle school, we called it all techno, but it was mostly house. And uh, this does not seem like something that is particularly deep because it's not, but there is sort of this continual fight that just like rolls over and over every couple of years of dubstep people and house people just hating each other for no reason essentially, except that this is exactly it. They can categorize each other and it's you are not in my category and therefore you are a lesser being. Very, very silly stuff. In 1971, when social psychologist Henri Teifel and his colleagues brought a group of 48 teenage boys together in a suburb of Bristol, England, they showed them 6 paintings by Paul Klee and 6 paintings by Vasily Kandinsky. The boys weren't told which paintings were by which artist, but they were asked which works they preferred. And I don't know if how well you will be able to see, but these are examples of the paintings in question. So like they are different enough, but definitely still, I think they were both Cubist. I think it's Cubism is what that specific thing is. And so their paintings were very similar to each other, is the point here. So the boys were asked which works they preferred. They weren't told who painted what. Then they were told that they'd been placed in groups based on their artistic preferences. Now, these paintings were all abstract works created around the same time period. They were not particularly divisive or provocative as artwork goes, and the boys already knew one another well from school, so they had many pre existing alliances among themselves. But once they were grouped by artistic preference, this new identity became salient. The boys immediately thought of themselves as fans of either Klee or Kandinsky. In fact, their group placement was randomized. It was a trick and kind of an unfair one. After all, the brain is wired to embrace the group once we're told that groups exist. It's not really optional. When the boys were asked to allocate monetary rewards to each other anonymously, most gave more rewards to boys in their supposed artistic preference group. The Klee boys favored other Klee boys over the Kandinsky boys, and vice versa, even though they received no tangible benefit for doing so. Our affinity for categories shows up in children from a very young age. Kids group people by race and gender before they know how to read. White American children show a subconscious bias against pictures of black faces by the time they're in elementary school. This seems to be true even for white kids attending majority black schools. This doesn't mean these white kids all grew up in overtly racist homes, nor does it mean they would necessarily act on their biases. It means that humans have survived by being aware of status differences, and we learn which categories matter in our society in all kinds of quiet, insidious ways. This is why it is so dangerous to set up binary choices in our communities on purpose, as Jefferson and Adams understood when they railed against the idea of political parties. There are much better ways to do politics, as we'll see, but we rarely question our binary traditions. National referendums, for example, seem like the ultimate form of democracy. Ask the people what they want. But referendums collapse complicated issues into 2 categories: yes or no, good or bad, Republicans or Federalists, old guard or new, Klee or Kandinsky. This plays right into our hardwired bias against the other. In 2016, binary referendums rocked the status quo on 3 continents. Voters were asked to approve or reject, among other things, in Britain, a scheme to split from the European Union; in Thailand, a new constitution that human rights groups said diminished democratic freedoms; and a 297-page peace deal in Colombia. following half a century of civil war. In real life, most people have complex, ambivalent feelings about things like immigration, globalization, democracy, corruption, drug trafficking, and reparations for victims. Their knowledge is uneven and their opinions are manifold. But the referendums forced them to choose a side, to see the world in two dimensions. After all these referendums finished, splicing Britain from the European Union, adopting a newly restrictive constitution in Thailand, and rejecting a peace deal in Colombia, the New York Times asked political scientist Michael Marsh whether referendums were ever a good idea. The simple answer is almost never, he said. They usually range from the pointless to the dangerous. Labels get created to serve a purpose for someone at a given point in time. I'm going to repeat that. That's important. Labels get created to serve a purpose for someone at a given point in time. Then the categories take on lives of their own, which is one reason referendums are so risky. One person's idea of a category is different from another's, and soon the category can be hijacked by others. In Muir Beach, the Old Guard did not refer to themselves as the quote-unquote Old Guard. The nickname was Gary's invention. Like other categories, this one required emphasizing one aspect of his opponents and setting aside or actively ignoring the rest. For example, the Old Guard didn't necessarily think of themselves as a united bloc. They were not controlled by a party machine, nor were they always in agreement. Two leaned libertarian, one just didn't like to spend money, another seemed to like being liked. All of them were just trying to give back to their community through volunteer service, just like Gary. All of them loved Muir Beach. Some of the Old Guard might have been tempted to brand Gary as the Old Guard. He'd lived in Muir Beach longer than anyone else on the board, after all. So why did Gary use the label? What did the new guard represent for him? Gary seemed to be trying to prove something, and it was about more than a bus stop. Storytelling. I first met Gary when I was reporting on polarization in politics. More and more people were sorting into partisan camps and demonizing the other side. The categories of good and evil, red and blue, racist and not racist, were getting really clear to people. Too clear. People were starting to believe that they could know one another's moral core without actually knowing one another at all. Sometimes I found myself surrendering to the same impulse. It felt very hard to resist. And I would say harder now to resist. I also feel this impulse and sometimes surrender to it. It is very difficult not to when it feels like it is dangerous not to. My own profession of journalism seemed to be making everything worse. No news story changed anyone's mind, it just left people feeling angry, disgusted, or hopeless. Immigration, police brutality, impeachment, the economy, climate change, everything was viewed through the filter of group biases. I kept thinking about the 2015 viral internet phenomenon known as the dress. Looking at the same image, millions of people had seen two totally different color patterns, and no amount of argument could change their perception. Some people saw a dress that was blue and black, others saw white and gold. The filter, our eyes, in the case of the dress, and our identity, in the case of politics, mattered far more than the facts. But instead of arguing over a dress, which was harmless, people were deeply divided over big things that actually mattered. Half the country saw Trump as a savior, the other saw him as a monster. Opinions didn't change much, no matter what happened. So when I heard about Gary's work getting underneath conflict, I was curious. I wanted to know if there was another way to do journalism, one that made conflict interesting again. The first time I interviewed Gary, I asked him if he had seen any political coverage lately that interested him. I suppose I was hoping he had some alternative news source, one I didn't know about. He said no. Journalists are completely trapped in this, he said matter-of-factly. There is no room for the story to take a different turn. What was the different turn that the story could take? You need to know what the conflict is really about, he said. Here was someone who had seen thousands of conflicts up close, not some clueless idealist, and he was telling me that I was missing the real story because I was in the tar pits just like everyone else. Then Gary invited me to join his next training. He'd never trained journalists before, but what I was trying to do was not radically different from what good mediators did. We both wanted to help people understand themselves, their problems, and the world a little better. I arrived at the training in Mexico and immediately wondered if I'd made a mistake. The group consisted of lawyers and therapists and me, alongside Gary and his colleague, Catherine Connor. The day began at 7:30 a.m. with a full hour of meditation, led by Norman Fisher, a Zen priest and a friend of Gary's. I started sweating. A full hour of meditation every day for a week? But everyone else went along with it, and so I did too. For an hour, we sat in a circle, not moving. Before these sessions, I'd only been awake and still for that long at the dentist. This was worse. Gary explained that meditation helps train the brain to be more reflective and open, even in the midst of conflict. So it's an important part of his toolkit. And I knew in theory that he might be right. I'd read the studies. Meditation can reduce blood pressure, ease the symptoms of anxiety and depression, and help people sleep better. For other people, exercising, gardening, praying, or listening to music can have a similar effect. Anything that helps the mind be a little more still and present. In my case, being still and present was not a strength. So I used the first hour of stillness to brainstorm excuses I could make to get out of meditating for the rest of the week. Then we moved on to a lesson on looping, and my confidence returned. I figured I would crush this one because I had spent much of my life listening to people tell me stories. I did it for a living. I always prepared carefully. I nodded and smiled. I furrowed my brow at all the right moments. I was charming, for God's sake. But that is not listening, Gary said. Proving you've heard someone is very different from acting like it. People instantly sense the distinction, he said. We got into pairs and tried it out. It did feel different from my normal listening. Looping forced me to really listen, first of all, and not think about my next question or when I could get another cup of coffee. It meant letting the other person lead, and I had to follow, which was a little scary. When I checked to see if I'd understood what the person said, I found I'd gotten it slightly wrong, more often than I would have expected. Then I'd try again and again until I got it right. Then, when we switched, I felt what it was like to be heard. And I had to admit that Gary was right. You can tell when someone is really listening to you. It's about more than the nodding and the smiling. That week changed how I work in fundamental ways, more than anything I'd done in 2 decades as a reporter. Gary's toolkit included all kinds of ways to make conflict more interesting, from looping to asking deeper questions to investigating the understory. From then on, I looped people whenever I interviewed them. I started looping my family, my friends, even strangers sitting next to me on an airplane. I didn't always do it well or at all, but when I did loop, I felt a little more present, a bit more useful. I sometimes interview people with whom I profoundly disagree. Then, looping turns out to be particularly critical. It helps me listen even when I don't want to. It takes a lot of practice, but it has helped me experience what it's like to understand and disagree at the same time. It turns out that is possible. You can do both. You can and you must if you want to stay out of the tar pits. I also put a post-it note with some of Gary's questions on my office wall, and I started asking them whenever I interviewed anyone involved in any kind of conflict. What would it be like if you got what you wanted here? What do you want your opponent to understand about you? What do you want to understand about them? I also started meditating for a whole 10 minutes a day, which still seemed like a lot. Gary and I kept in touch. He had mentioned that he'd recently run for office in his little town, and it wasn't going the way he'd expected. Uh, we will continue with that in just a second, but I want to back up a little bit and talk about the experience of understanding and also disagreeing at the same time. Um, and I'm going to take it a little bit further than what she explicitly says here, and like to be able to understand and disagree and also not have it turn into a really, really nasty, upsetting fight as a result. Um, because like I when I was in the church, right? When I was in Scientology, um, as with any cult, as with any high control group, like there are things that are capital R right and capital W wrong. And like if you disagree with something that is capital R right, then that makes you as a person capital W wrong and like puts you directly in danger simply because you don't agree with something that is ordained, right? And I think that this is not such a different experience from a lot of people, whether it is their own high control group of some kind that they have been part of, or even just like having to get through public school or college, or like having parents that don't permit you to ever be incorrect about anything without making it a fucking problem. Like, there are a lot of different ways that you can get there, but I do think that a lot of us, especially people around my age, millennials, whatever, really have this sort of like subconscious feeling of I can't be wrong. I can't be wrong about anything important because if I'm wrong about an important thing, then I the being am wrong. Everything about me is wrong and I should just fucking kill myself. Um which is like not how being human works. A lot of us are wrong a lot of the time about a lot of stuff. And being able to separate things that you believe or things that you say or things that you think from who you are at the core of your being is so important to ever being able to resolve any conflicts. And I don't think that that particular skill is encouraged very well in people these days. Like, maybe never, right? These days, I only know these days because I've only been alive for these days. Um, but like, I think that there is a lot of like survival tied up in being right. And like, there is very little wiggle room to both be a good person and also be wrong. All right. No eyeball rolling. It's the next section here. On February 3rd, 2016, Gary presided over his inaugural meeting as president of the Muir Beach Community Services District Board of Directors. He introduced a new set of rules called the Principles of Unity, which he had drafted with help from Tanya, the community organizer and his closest advisor. He posted the principles on the wall of the community center where the board met. Be respectful of others. One person speaks at a time. No name calling. No eyeball rolling. During the public comment period, each person would be limited to just 3 minutes of speaking, according to the principles. This way, the gadflies who had rambled on at past board meetings would not be able to hijack the conversation. There would be space for more voices to be heard. When Gary introduced this time limit, one resident objected, but the board briskly adopted the rules anyway, by vote of 4-1. The dissenting vote was from a member of the old guard. Gary didn't worry too much about it. He and Elizabeth rearranged the chairs for the meeting so that everyone, including the board, sat in a large circle at the same level. The idea was to make the meeting feel inclusive, to give the power back to the people, just as Gary did in his mediation trainings. When people spoke, Gary looped them. He distilled what they said into the most elegant language he could muster, and then checked to see if his summary was right. He also established a dozen different volunteer subcommittees, open to any and all, in hopes of bringing more residents into governing the town, just the way he'd brought the full ensemble of musicians into the room in his work with the San Francisco Symphony. There was a subcommittee for community engagement, for audits, for trails, for roads, for everything that might matter to the residents. The public could come to the subcommittee meetings, but only the subcommittee members would be allowed to talk, so that the meetings wouldn't get bogged down. I really welcome anybody in this community that wants to participate in any of these committees, Gary said. The more the merrier. He was doing what he'd promised, infusing local politics with new energy and civility. His allies loved the new rules. That felt good. But some people made jokes. They called the new rules Gary's psychobabble, and they rolled their eyes, violating multiple principles of unity at once. God forbid. Whoop, oh God. I lost my page. One moment, please. There we go. There were other changes too. Under Gary's leadership, there were no more bowls of snacks, no more time set aside for socializing. People could do that on their own time, Gary figured. The first meeting he presided over lasted exactly 2 hours, as scheduled. Looking at the clock, he beamed with pride. In the past, the meetings had droned on well past 9 p.m., draining everyone's spirit, or at least Gary's spirit. Ending on time seemed like another victory, this one for basic human decency. It was all very exciting, he said. I felt heroic, righteous. He was bringing politics back to the people where it belonged. It's amazing, Gary noticed, how inflating it can be to have power and feel like you can get something done. Gary's wife, Trish, left the meeting after the first hour, claiming Artie the dog was getting restless. The righteous. Gary wasn't unfamiliar with the adversarial culture endemic to politics. You could say he was born into it, actually. Long before he'd moved to California, Gary had been raised in a family of litigators in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His father was a lawyer, so was his uncle. It wasn't easy for Gary's father to start a career as a Jewish lawyer in the 1930s and 40s. In many parts of Connecticut, white Christians followed gentlemen's agreements not to sell homes to blacks, Jews, or other minorities. Many country clubs and law firms were closed to him, explicitly or not. Gary's father learned to never show weakness, even to himself. He was an example, Gary said, of someone who never failed, even when he was failing. At the dinner table, Gary said, every conversation was about who was to blame, and it was never his father. If his father lost a case, it was because a juror was drunk or a judge was biased. Any problem with the outside world was, we were right and they were wrong, Gary said. But from an early age, Gary wondered what was missing from his father's stories. He couldn't say so out loud, but he distrusted his father's righteousness. Righteousness, it must be said, worked well in court much of the time, and sometimes it led to significant moral victories. There are times when fighting them with every tactic available is the only good choice. In 1940, a white Greenwich woman accused her black chauffeur of raping her 4 times in one night, then kidnapping her, tying her up, and dumping her in a reservoir before trying to stone her while she was in the water. The chauffeur admitted to having sex with his employer, but insisted it had been consensual. The police claimed he'd confessed to rape. Somebody wasn't telling the truth. The case provoked lurid headlines, spurring some white families to fire their black employees out of fear that they might meet the same fate. That's when Gary's father and uncle took the chauffeur's case. They worked alongside a black lawyer at the NAACP named Thurgood Marshall. Together, the lawyers identified the inconsistencies in the woman's improbable story. They realized how little evidence the prosecutor had against their client. Gary's uncle already believed the prosecutor to be a bigot. He hated everybody, he said later. If you were a Pollock, if you were a Jew, if you were and I'm not going to say that slur out loud, but he does say a slur there. At the trial, the attorneys mercilessly attacked the woman's credibility. They used every trick they could think of to sow doubt in the government's case. Gary's uncle cross-examined the woman, needling her with questions. Why had she invited the chauffeur into her bedroom when she was only wearing a bathrobe? Why hadn't she dislodged the phone receiver to alert the operator she was in trouble? Then he pulled out a handkerchief and had Gary's father gag him, exactly as she'd said the chauffeur had done. The jury looked stunned when he showed how easily she could have called out for help when a police officer had stopped their car at one point that night. The all-white jury deliberated for nearly 13 hours. Finally, the verdict came in. The chauffeur was found innocent of all charges. It was a powerful story, one Gary would hear his entire childhood. It encapsulated the essence of being a great lawyer, according to his father. Heroic, take no prisoners, fight for the underdog. The world was divided clearly into categories: good and evil, right and wrong. And you fought until your side, the good side, won. The ends always justified the means. Gary went to law school and joined the family business. For 5 years, he worked as a trial lawyer at Friedman and Friedman, and he was good at it too. Aggressive, cutting, quick. I was an attack dog. He loved the adrenaline rush when he made it seem as though a witness was lying on cross-examination, even if the witness was telling the truth. He felt powerful, but he also felt, from the beginning, a deep unease with the entire enterprise. It was not unlike the feeling he'd had at the dinner table as a kid, doubting his father's stories. I had to divide the complex world into oversimplified camps labeled right and wrong. In one case in 1973, Gary represented a woman who had been rear ended at a traffic light. She was suing the man's insurance company for damages, citing injuries she'd suffered in the crash. But the odds were against her, and Gary was up against a more experienced attorney, an insufferable prep school type who thought highly of himself and not at all about Gary. Gary came up with a strategy. Throughout the trial, and especially during the closing argument, Gary depicted his client as a woman deserving of compassion. She was quiet, a bit overweight, and struggling to pay her bills as a young writer. Who should the jury trust, her or a big insurance company? The jury awarded $5,500 to Gary's client, nearly 32 grand today. He celebrated, hugging his client, feeling triumphant. Just then, he turned and saw the look on the other attorney's face. The prep school man looked crestfallen, humiliated. He'd have to go back to his firm, Gary knew, and explain why he hadn't settled the case for far less weeks before when he'd had the chance. I remember being so elated, and then I felt so sad, Gary said. I didn't like him, but I felt sympathetic to what that must feel like. Gary averted his eyes, unable to make eye contact with the lawyer. This happened after other verdicts in other cases. He felt, with each victory, like he'd lost something he couldn't quite put a name to. At age 30, the month he was to be named managing partner of his father's firm, he quit. His family was crushed. His father had planned his whole life around Gary taking over. Judges called Gary into their chambers to tell him he was making a terrible mistake, but Gary didn't change his mind. He and Trish moved to California, where Gary invented a new way to practice law. Starting with Jay and Lorna, his friends who wanted a divorce, he brought both sides of the conflict together to listen and be understood. His father did not approve. Real men practice law in a courtroom, fighting it out until there was a single victor. Not this. But Gary felt like he was living right for the first time in his life. Whoa, that got heavy. I am so sorry. I completely forgot that that story was part of this chapter. Um, Otherwise, I would have done a trigger warning. All right. Private melodies. As labels go, new and old guard are very gentle. Gary was not dehumanizing his opponents, but the labels created clarity, like Klee and Kandinsky. They simplified the election in a way that was motivating for Gary. He was the agent of change along with his allies. The old guard, they were the agents of the status quo. The problem is that the usefulness of labels begins to decay the moment the election results come in. That is, when the governing needs to begin. At that point, people need to cooperate to get things done, especially in democracies. But the primal feelings generated by the competition linger long after the ballots are counted. In fact, to expect a politician to truly unite a community after winning a contested election is to utterly misunderstand human psychology. Once Gary had won, the conflict mindset was almost certain to get worse, not better. The feeling of winning can make the victorious side feel more aggressive, not less. Winning at just about anything tends to boost testosterone. When Gary talked about that election outcome, he always referred to it as an unprecedented landslide. He hadn't just won, he had done something else. He had done something no one else had ever done. He was using outsized language. The way he saw it, the stakes were very high, much higher than they appeared to me, an outside observer. By summer, the meetings were starting to become more tense. Gary spent much of his energy enforcing the principles of unity. I really hope to hold people to our 3-minute limit tonight, he told the spectators as he opened up the June meeting. When one person tried to ask a question about a different subject, Gary cut him off. Not tonight, he said. The man raised his voice. Well, I'm not going to leave here till I get a chance to publicly comment. Well, you can stay all night, Gary said, but we're not going to address it. The man persisted, but Gary would not yield. I'm going to stop you right there. You're out of order. 9 minutes later, Gary officially opened up the public comment period and allowed the man to speak. You've got 3 minutes, he reminded him. The process mattered. Later that night, when Gary came home, he encountered more pushback, this time from his closest confidant, his own wife. He was cutting people off, hurting people's feelings, Trish told him. You are running these meetings so tightly. It's all about the time limit, she said. I was sure you would be able to bring magic to these meetings, and to me, you're doing the opposite. Gary defended himself. The old guard had been sending their minions to the meetings to obstruct change and criticize every initiative, he told her. Trish did not seem to appreciate that he was under attack, no matter how many times he tried to explain, using that specific word, attack. He'd intended the subcommittees to represent democracy, inclusion, and fresh ideas. The old guard saw bureaucracy, wasteful and unnecessary. Everything he did, it seemed, was met with new aggression and derision. Gary thought his affection for Muir Beach was apparent, and so was his devotion to fairness and inclusivity. He thought it was obvious why he was creating the subcommittees, to get more people involved, as he kept saying. And it was true. Why wouldn't people believe him? It felt like his opponents were just out to get him, and that may have been true some of the time. It's also true that we all suffer from the illusion of communication. We overestimate how well we have conveyed our intentions and ideas. We think people can read our minds because we know our own minds so well. Gary thought it was obvious why he enforced the 3-minute rule and created the subcommittees. But was it? The illusion of communication. If you were to tap out the rhythm, in fact, I'm going to tap out a rhythm for you guys, if you can hear it. Except that I don't know which microphone is currently working, so I don't know if the mic will pick it up. Let's see. Okay, I think it's picking up. I don't know if that picked up at all, but uh, yep, that's correct. If you tapped out the rhythm too, happy birthday on a table right now, how hard do you think it would be for other people to guess what song you're tapping? I'm going to say hard, difficult. I also don't know if the mic picked up that whole thing, but the book says to try it out, so I did. Pick a popular song, any song, and tap it out. See if anyone can guess what it is. When college students were asked to tap out the rhythm of any of 25 well-known songs, they predicted that the people listening would correctly guess about half of them. After all, the person doing the tapping could hear the melody, the instruments, and even the lyrics in her head. It was so obvious. Out of 120 tapped out songs, the listeners guessed just under 3% correctly. This is the illusion of communication. We consistently overestimate our ability to communicate. We lack empathy for what it is like to be outside our own heads. The listener occupies a different reality, hearing only a series of dull, barren taps one after the other. It sounds like nothing at all. The biggest problem in communication, as the saying goes, is the illusion that it has taken place. This illusion comes from two profoundly human mistakes. First, we think we have conveyed our intentions and desires clearly when we haven't. And second, we don't really know what our intentions and desires are. In many conflicts, we have only the flimsiest grasp of the understory, both our own understory and the one belonging to the other side. When Gary was doing the tapping, it was extremely difficult to get outside of his own head, to realize just how differently the world appeared to everyone else. And the same was true for the old guard. They did not hear what Gary heard. They were listening to their own private melodies. In experiments, people generally overestimate how obvious it is to others when they are amused, alarmed, nervous, or even lying. We think we're an open book, and we're not. When we behave badly, we naturally take into account all the details that led us to do what we did, all the circumstantial evidence. I still remember a red light I accidentally ran in Texas many years ago. I was on assignment in a city I didn't know, trying to find an address, and I just didn't see the light. Someone honked, and I looked up just in time to see the red light as I blew past it. I felt shocked, embarrassed, and grateful no one had gotten hurt. Never did I consider that maybe I was just a reckless asshole. When we consider other people's behavior by contrast, we reflexively blame their inherent moral failings. I saw someone run a red light the other day in my neighborhood in DC, and I immediately concluded that the driver was arrogant. The laws didn't apply to him, apparently. Even as I write this, I remain convinced of my judgment, despite the glaring hypocrisy it implies. In reality, some people who run red lights are arrogant. Others are distracted, or depressed, or angry about other things. Many 20-something reckless drivers become far safer drivers in their 40s. It's hard to carry that complexity around in our heads, so we default to the idiot driver reflex, particularly if we don't know or trust the other driver. We're easy prey out here in the sunshine. We need to identify the enemy. The truth is, people didn't trust Gary, and he didn't trust them. This distrust made the idiot driver reflex harder to disrupt. His neighbors brought their own feelings and assumptions to the meetings, their own desires to belong. Gary's changes upended traditions that many of them had helped to build. They were the ones who had brought the bowls of snacks to the meeting. They had seen these small rituals as important, a way to show their neighborliness and hospitality. What Gary saw as common sense reforms felt, to some, like a rebuke. Even when his changes were good, they were coming too fast for some people. He wasn't listening to everyone the way he had as a mediator. He couldn't let other people own the problem and the solution the way he did at work. He felt, as the president of the board, that he had to co-own these things because he'd be held responsible for the results. He wasn't as curious about the concerns that lay underneath the old guard's complaints because he wasn't in the middle anymore. He was part of the conflict. To some extent, he'd created it. He was looping like crazy. At least he was trying to. But it seemed like the same people needed to be heard over and over again. He couldn't let them hijack the meetings. There had to be space for the other neighbors to talk. But where was everybody? That was another problem. He was doing everything he could to get more people into the room, beyond the most local kvetchers, but they weren't showing up. The most reasonable people in the neighborhood didn't care enough about the board's decisions to spend their evenings on them. The people who had encouraged him to run, who had said they wanted change, were not at the meetings. Anyone who has served in any form of public office will recognize this problem. Extremists have outsized influence because they always show up when everyone else stays home. They are the ones on Twitter day and night when everyone else is out living their lives. This absence felt like a betrayal on one level. On a deeper level, it felt like a personal failure. Gary's identity as a man who healed conflict and helped people come together was under threat. His tools for negotiating differences, looping, going down the Y trail, giving everyone a voice, respecting the process, those tools were not working. And the implications were devastating for him personally. Just like the crock pot was not a crock pot for the couple in his office, Gary had more at stake than it appeared. Without realizing what was happening, Gary had been drawn into the conflict trap. Everything he did to resolve the conflict, inviting more people, enforcing the rules of civility, seemed to make it worse. That is what happens in the tar pits. It felt like we were at war. It was around this time that Gary made a tactical error. Muir Beach needed to raise the water rates. The rates hadn't gone up in 7 years, even though water management costs had increased. The town had been covering the difference using money from various other sources, but California law required that water be paid for using water utility payments only. So, to comply with the law, Gary supported doubling the water rates virtually overnight. The old guard erupted in outrage. They reminded everyone that Gary had said he knew nothing about water at the debate. How could they allow him to double the water rate? The rates don't need to be increased by 100%, Hugh said at a public meeting. That's like off the charts high. No one likes to see their utility bill double. For most families in Muir Beach, the increase would have amounted to about $300 in additional costs a year, a significant amount of money. But remember, this was happening in a relatively wealthy community. The median household income was $112,000, almost double the national average. For most residents, $300 was really not a lot of money. And just in case it was, the proposal would have granted a 50% discount in water rates to any household earning less than $90,000 a year. But the blowback to the proposed increase was not just about money. It was about the idiot driver reflex. It was easy for Gary's neighbors to assume the worst about the water rate increase, to attribute Gary's proposal to his inherent character flaws rather than the situation. He must be arrogant, power hungry, or incompetent, they thought, just like someone who runs a red light. What else could explain his tendency to cut people off in meetings and create unnecessary subcommittees? It all made sense in a way. In retrospect, Gary might have been better off proposing a gradual increase over 5 years. He had thought about that option, but then he was persuaded that the old guard had been wrong to ignore the shortfalls, and it was time to do right by the community. He imagined there would be some grumbling before everyone agreed that the 100% increase was a necessity. Instead, the move galvanized his opponents. They started accusing Gary of wasteful spending. They mounted a comeback campaign for the next election, further dividing the town. By October of 2017, the Marin Independent Journal was deploying Gary's labels in its headlines. Muir Beach election pits old guard against new. The categories were now explicit. Only this time, the insurgents were not Gary and Elizabeth. They were Jim and Hugh, two members of the old guard who had decided to run for election to stop Gary and Elizabeth. Gary's labels had been hijacked. Yeah, Gary is really. Oh, we're really in it now, Gary. The tension was palpable. Another local newspaper ran another story about the two camps, this time quoting a Muir Beach woman. I do not feel the comfort of passing certain people on the street, she said. By then, Gary had started to see his town's politics mirrored in the national news. Just like the politicians on TV, his critics were playing dirty, he believed, using half-truths and fear to turn people against him. It was grandiose of him, he now admits, but at the time, everything fit neatly into place. He had a new label for the old guard, a new narrative, and it was even more powerful than the old one. He started to identify the old guard with Trump. I couldn't get it out of my head, he said. It felt like we were at war. The community disagreements had morphed into high conflict, an all-consuming, larger-than-life, urgent fight. I no longer saw them, Gary told me later. I no longer had a sense of proportion about me, and I lost myself. The board's disagreements were different from Gary's mediation cases. Well, they weren't that different. They just felt different to Gary. Instead of hostility being directed between parties at each other, it was directed at me, he explained. That was excruciating. Here he was, a renowned expert in conflict mediation. He should have been lecturing around the world, writing more books, and taking on lucrative cases. Instead, he had chosen to devote a good part of his time to work, for free, to help his tiny town. Where was the gratitude? This feeling of being unappreciated, even rejected by his neighbors, was powerful. It felt like a kind of toxin. Why, he wondered, did it bother him so much? Cyberball. In the mid 1990s, social psychologists started studying the effects of exclusion, rejection, and ostracism in the laboratory. They found they could easily and dramatically induce these feelings in people. For instance, at the University of Toledo, a psychologist named Kipling Williams brought 228 college students into his lab one by one, ostensibly to do a brainstorming exercise. Before the exercise began, however, two other people in the waiting room, who worked in the lab unbeknownst to the student, would discover a ball in a pile of things and begin tossing it around. At first, they'd throw the ball between all three people in the waiting room. Then, after 1 minute of jovial ball play, the undercover researchers would start excluding the subject of the experiment and just throw the ball between the two of them without explanation. They'd continue playing this way for 4 minutes until the official researcher returned to the room. Now, I don't know. How ethical is this? Is this ethical? Chat, is this ethics? Is this ethics in research? I don't know. But let's keep learning about the ball. When the ball tossing changed, the excluded student would initially laugh and try to make eye contact with the ball throwers, attempting to re-ingratiate herself. When that didn't work, she would typically stop smiling, withdraw, and become quiet. She might suddenly search for something in her backpack. Though the ordeal lasted only 4 minutes, the atmosphere was intensely uncomfortable for everyone involved. The researchers found it difficult to continue throwing the ball. Other researchers even found it difficult to watch from behind a one-way mirror. The exclusion triggered an almost primal sense of distress in anyone who witnessed it. In later experiments, the psychologists found they could create the same sense of exclusion digitally through a simple online game they named Cyberball, in which two or three other players toss a virtual ball to the participant before stopping. In fact, the other players are digital avatars controlled by the programmer. Despite the cartoonish nature of the graphics, the same pattern emerged as in the face-to-face experiment. It only took a couple of minutes for the excluded player to feel intense surges of sadness and anger. More than 5,000 people have now participated in these cyberball studies across at least 62 countries. Some of these people had their brains scanned while they played. The scans show heightened brain activity in the same areas triggered by physical pain. Williams began referring to the effects of rejection and ostracism as social pain. Remarkably, social pain does not seem to vary depending on a person's personality type. How can all of us feel such anguish even from a brief virtual encounter with digital avatars? How can something so impersonal feel extremely personal? Humans have certain fundamental emotional needs, including the need for a sense of belonging, for self-esteem, for control, and for a meaningful existence. These needs are nearly as important to our survival as food and water. Social rejection threatens these needs. I know. Big fucking oof. Triple oof for those of us with RSD. Whew. For Gary, serving on the board jeopardized all four of these fundamental needs. He no longer felt a sense of belonging in his own neighborhood. His self-esteem, which was tightly bound to proving he could bring people together to work through conflict, was fracturing. His carefully honed process, including the subcommittees and time limits, was mocked by the so-called old guard. What did it mean for his life's work that his toolkit wasn't working in his own town? Was his whole career some kind of joke? Rejection is especially debilitating when it blindsides us, as it did for Gary. In experiments, people who expect acceptance and encounter rejection instead tend to react with more hostility. That's because threats that are unexpected and unpredictable feel more dangerous to us. In Gary's case, he had been recruited to run for election as a savior, and he was received, at least by some, as a nag, buffoon, or villain. The only rational way to make sense of it without gutting his own sense of self was to blame the old guard. In study after study, ostracized people typically respond the same way. Sorry, I'm going to give that to you again. Hang on. I need a little sippy sip of water. All right. In study after study, ostracized people typically respond the same way. First, they try to win back the affection of others. They hasten to conform and comply, or try to. If that doesn't work, they become aggressive. And people who feel disrespected, as Gary did, respond with even more aggression than people who simply feel disliked. Despite everything he knew, Gary succumbed to blame. I became defensive, he admitted to me much later. I became aggressive. I became strategic. Aggression usually guarantees more social rejection, but it does succeed in one way. It gives us a renewed sense of control over our environment, thus restoring one of our most fundamental needs, if only temporarily. Likewise, if we demonize people who have excluded us, we can help restore our damaged self esteem. We are good and they are evil. Demonization can give us a sense of purpose as well. We're fighting evil. What could be more meaningful? When politicians muster the courage to defy their party leaders and call out lying and misbehavior, they often end up ostracized from their party and their people. They experience intense social pain, which either forces them to return to the fold, becoming overly compliant to the party line, or to lash out to protect themselves. This is why shaming politicians typically backfires. It can feel good. It can restore that sense of agency temporarily. But shaming is an extreme form of social rejection. It is different from applying pressure on someone who cares what you think or who needs your support for some reason. That can work. But shame has the opposite effect. It almost always makes the opponent stronger, especially if someone from another group does the shaming. It cements the division, bringing the other side closer together in fear or anger, emboldening them. It affirms the belief that they are on the side of good and their critics are on the side of evil. Terrible news for those of us who enjoy bullying alt-right politicians on Twitter. Can't a girl have hobbies? In June of 2018, the owner of an upscale rural Virginia restaurant called the Red Hen asked Trump spokesperson Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her family to leave, citing her support for Trump's policies toward gay people. Then a waiter wrote about the incident on social media, and reporters started calling Sanders for comment. She responded from, as she saw it, the moral high ground. Last night I was told by the owner of Red Hen to leave, and I politely left. Her actions say far more about her than about me, Sanders wrote to her 4.2 million followers on Twitter. I always do my best to treat people, including those I disagree with, respectfully and will continue to do so. President Trump weighed in, calling the restaurant filthy to his 71.4 million followers. Threats poured in against the restaurant's owner, the town's mayor, the police, and the farmers who supplied the restaurant. 75 people showed up to protest and yell at each other outside the restaurant, which closed for 10 days. Sanders ended up getting Secret Service protection. Ku Klux Klan flyers appeared in the neighborhood surrounding the restaurant. The tar pits got a little more crowded each day. I fear I still will. Yes, I'm not telling you to stop bullying alt-right politicians on Twitter. I am simply observing that I don't think that is the way out, unfortunately. Also, hang on, I have to sneeze. Oh, and I hate to leave you at this spot, which is so fraught, but we are about to start the next section, and my voice is starting to hurt. So I'm going to call it there for today. We are on page 74, the section that starts, it has the heading, I Feel Like We Have Lost You, in chapter 2 of High Conflict. If you are reading on your own and want to read some more, last time I think I ended up reading about the same number of pages, like 30 to 40 pages. So very likely, let's see here. Okay, for sure we will finish chapter 2 next time and get started on chapter 3. I just don't know how far into chapter 3 we will get. Yes, it has been so much fun. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. Thank you for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube or a replay or just listening to it as a podcast, thank you for doing so. I appreciate you as well. And if you have comments, leave comments, and I will try to remember to come back and look at comments and engage, even if it is later on. Um, and now me and my two viewers who are also mods are going to go raid a channel